Welcome to our lecture on Dante and his Divine Comedy. Dante occupies a unique position in this semester's itinerary, but he also, I think, in the whole course of the great conversation, insofar as he is at the acme of the medieval and leads very directly into the Renaissance and modernity. But as the acme of modernity, he's also taking up the substance of classical antiquity. So we have in this figure, in this mind, this spirit, a capacity, a capaciousness that is reaching for the summation of the human spirit. And that's really what you get in what is perhaps the greatest poem ever written. The Divine Comedy it contains worlds, literally, but it contains the drama of our world, and in a way that we still find very immediate. People read this poem now and are deeply moved. This is a personality, a subjectivity that we recognize as our own. Dante presumably was born in 1265. We're working backwards from the way he talks about his life at the beginning of the Commedia, the middle of his life. So 1265, more or less. He dies in 1321. At the time of his death, he's already seeing the beginning of the disintegration of the great high medieval order. We have the Babylonian captivity of the papacy already begun in 1309. So in his exile, Dante would have already seen this move into away from Rome, and which was so dear to him that the papacy and Rome were inseparable. Now, this is something Dante took to have immense meaning. Well, the papal court had been moved under pressure from the French monarchy to Avignon, in ecclesiastical territory, but in what we now know of as France. So in the French sphere of influence at that time. So that was one of the great disasters, really, for the medieval mind. It is just to have Rome. So we think back about the sacks of Rome that happened in the 5th century. These were devastating for the mind of Europe, as it were. Even if the political power wasn't there anymore. Well, the political power isn't in Rome at this point, but the spiritual power is in the papacy, and that's one of the two great international, as it were, foci of authority. And here Rome is losing its place, and so that would have been devastating for the European soul. And also we're beginning to see the demographic disasters that constitute the most obvious component of the crisis of the 14th century. That is, population had been increasing, making possible a re-civilizing, a re-urbanizing of Europe from 1000 on until the beginning of the 1300s. And then Europe hit its limit, given the capacity of the land, given that the technology of the time to support population. You're beginning to get famines, and that's before, and then there's climate problems, and then that's before the Black Death truly devastates everything in the middle of the 1300s. So this crisis is already something that Dante in his exile is looking at. But there it is. He in his own person, in his learning, in his spirit, he's got the whole medieval, all that energy that flourished in this unique form of order in the history of the world. That's in Dante, and he expresses it in this great poem. In that poem, the Divine Comedy, we have a journey through the worlds of the afterlife. And he's wanting us to look at our lives against the backdrop of eternity. So we want to ask this question: would we live our lives differently in light of an eternal drama? If we thought of our actions in terms of an eternal consequence or an eternal entailment, would we make different choices now? I think that obviously is something Dante makes very dramatic as a kind of question for us. Okay, we don't want to do too much of the biography. but it's important to know that he marries this woman, Gemma Donati, in around 1285. When he was, it seems, by his own account, 9 years old, he had met a girl about the same age named Beatrice, he reports, and this is the great Inamorata, the great lady of his imagination and his soul. And as we've seen with the Romance of the Rose and in the background there, the kind of courtly love legacy that Dante is very profoundly shaping in his own work. Marriage and the most passionate love aren't necessarily the one things that would go hand in hand. So even though he's married to Gemma Donati, his love for Beatrice, which is on a different level, continues. Beatrice dies in 1290, and this is a spur to his literary production. He presents a lot of his earlier poems in the context of a story about Beatrice in the La Vita Nuova or Vita Nova, depending on whether one thinks the original title is Italian or Latin. Because of this legislation in the Florentine Commune, which was an oligarchic republic, the ordinances of justice in 1290 allow him, he belonged to a minor noble family, so those ordinances of justice allowed some of the old aristocrats to get involved in the politics, which involved first joining a guild. So he joined a guild and was able to move up the ranks and became one of the set of priors for the 2-month term in the summer of 1300. So that's the very pinnacle of Florentine political life. So this poet, who was a very ambitious poet, whose identity was shaped around being a great poet, also cared very deeply about the civic life of his city, and he was involved. This brings us to the background story of Florentine politics, though, which is the great debate between, or the factional strife between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. This was not just a factionalism within the city of Florence. All the city-states of northern Italy were swept up in this debate between a party that aligned itself with papal interests, the Guelphs, and a party that aligned itself with the imperial interests, the Ghibellines. Imperial meaning having to do with the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor are the two possible claimants in Europe at this time for what? It's the fountainhead of international order. International, we have to put in quotes because nations didn't exist at this time, but as an authority that transcended all of the political divisions of the time. Who got to underwrite the authority of whom? Right? Was the Pope the one who made clear that the emperor had, as happened in the beginning, right? When Charlemagne was crowned emperor, reviving the title that had lapsed since 476 in the West. Once he was proclaimed emperor, it was at the hands of the Pope at the time. Conversely, emperors had invested many bishops with their authority, and that was the controversy, the investiture controversy. Who is actually authorizing whom to be powers in Europe? Well, the Guelph and Ghibelline strife, which in Florence is and in all the towns, the cities of northern Italy, this is just an overlay on deep family, tribal kind of feudings that were going on. It's been noted before, right? That kind of blood in the streets that we see in Romeo and Juliet, that's the kind of scene that we've got here. In the case of Florence, this had to do with, like 1215, there was a broken marriage arrangement which caused the families there to line up in this way between Guelphs and Ghibellines. It wasn't, in the first instance, which ideology did you support, papal or imperial? It was, we have these battles going on and we need big guns to bring in to try to win. The city of Florence was mostly Guelph in tenor. but there were notable breaks in that tenor. That is, in 1260, you have the Battle of Monteperti, which let the Ghibellines have an ascendancy, and again, the exile of the Guelphs at the time. There was an important battle in the south of Italy in 1266, the Battle of Benevento. That's important because that basically crushed the Hohenstaufen, the German family that was at the seat of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. There was a cadet branch of the French monarchy. The Angevins were able to defeat the King Manfred, who was the son of Frederick II. That meant that the Ghibelline, that is the imperial power, would have gone into decline because the imperial power was basically crushed at the Battle of Benevento. The final squashing of any Ghibelline influence in Florence really came in the Battle of Campaldino in 1289, at which Dante himself fought. Okay, with that Guelph-Ghibelline strife over, with Guelph victory, we have further factionalism. The Guelphs themselves split. So by the time Dante is born, he's born into a world in which the older polar opposition was switching to another one, the whites and the blacks. His family came to belong to the white Guelph faction, and they are less papal than the black Guelphs, as it were. They're more opposed to papal interference in the city of Florence. It's not really a resort to the imperial too much because, again, there wasn't much. Though Dante, in fact, will, as it were, tilt towards the Ghibelline position because he will always hope that a Holy Roman Emperor will be able to come back to Italy, unite Italy, and bring political order, end factional strife in the cities by asserting a kind of imperial comedy. So that would be his desire. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines tended to be lined up also in terms of class differences. The Guelphs were more quote-unquote popular, that is, they had to do with the new money, the merchant classes. Florence was a rising city in the late 1200s, maybe 40 to 50,000. We've seen how these are small compared to the cities of the great cities of the Muslim world, but at this time, those cities are in decline, these are rising. Florence was a key, one of the key centers of international finance. Its currency, the florin, was basically the great currency, the international denominator, as it were. And that was allied to the wool manufacturing that was so prominent in the city. So eventually the Medici money, for instance, would be that great banking fortune would be based on the fact that Florence was the center of international finance. So that's causing all of this social change, that there's a lot of new money. So the Guelphs would have been allied with that, and then the white Guelphs would have been allied with that later. As opposed to the old aristocrats, based on agricultural, not mercantile productivity. That would have been the Ghibelline, but also then the black Guelph lineup. Okay. In the great struggle between papal and imperial, you have Boniface VIII, the Pope, at the time that the Divine Comedy is set, which is 1300. Boniface VIII, or more to the point, Boniface VIII was the Pope when Dante was one of the priors of Florence in 1300. Boniface the Pope intrigued with Charles, Count of Valois, to get the blacks to win out in the city of Florence. Even though there was that alliance, the actual King of France, Philip IV, Philip the Fair, definitely in scare quotes here, was a great opponent of Boniface VIII, and so you have now you have a shift from the great struggle between the emperor and the Pope to the new monarch and the Pope. So the monarchies, of course, of these new nations of France, of England. France and England would be the two that we know most, but the monarchies of Europe are going to be the ones that will try to claim the power going forward, the power of the modern nation state as we come to know it. Okay, so Boniface VIII is a great villain for Dante. He orchestrates the defeat of the whites at the hands the white guelphs at the hands of the black guelphs, and that leads to Dante's exile in 1302, from which he will never he never comes back from this exile. His beloved city of Florence he never sees again, which is really quite devastating. He lives until 1321. He spends the first few years in exile trying to intrigue a return, trying to see if white guelphs could get the military backing to wrest control back again. But eventually he turns to writing this great work, the Commedia, the Divine Comedy. And what we find here, he begins the poem by saying, in the middle of our life, actually, he puts all of us right into the very existential crisis of the poem. He puts us all there in the middle of our lives. I lost my way, and I was in a dark wood. Well, at the end of this poem, what you've got is a man who's been trained as a pilgrim through all the worlds of the afterlife to become a prophetic poet. He is thought of by many of us as il poeta, the poet. He's certainly one of the greatest, if not the greatest poet who's ever lived. But he also is trying to speak truth about social power, about how it is we ought to live our lives together, and how we ought to look at what it would be to live a flourishing human life. So he writes this poem in the vernacular, which is very important. This is one of the reasons he can be seen as a definite shift to the modern, as opposed to the great international language of the time, which is Latin, which is the language of the church. You've got, and here he represents that whole social movement. You've got cities that are built on lay literacy. So that's the new phenomenon, right? Not just, you've got merchants, even though he wasn't crazy about the mercantile economy. And this is one of those contradictions you have to we may have to think beyond Dante, actually. It's a very, quote unquote, democratic thing for him to write in the vernacular. Even if he didn't like all those changes that were coming about, he's helping to push them on. He's writing, he's vindicating a lay energy. So, as it were, secular energy. And he does that with his political theology, too. He's saying it's not the Pope that should be having him say. So Boniface VIII wrote this bull, I think, Unam Sanctam, which claimed that the church is the source of temporal power, too. And Dante says, no, there are two powers, the secular and the spiritual, and they need to be both strong, vigorous, and one can't claim authority over the other. That's his position. That's his recipe for order, and that's a way of trying to think through a lay polity, right? How do you live life when clerics aren't necessarily the ones to run the show? So that's part of what he's doing here. He is inheriting the troubadour poetic legacy, which we saw with the Romance of the Rose, is something that gets initiated and fed in the courts of what is now the south of France, then very definitely not part of the Kingdom of France. It moves to the Kingdom of Sicily as Frederick II in his court, the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily. There are troubadours there who then are taken up into the north of Italy, and it's going to be Dante's use of the Tuscan dialect that's going to determine the shape of the Italian language going forward. So his beautiful handling of the language is going to give the modern nation of Italy its lingua franca. as in fantasy novels, there are rules of the game. Well, there are some rules of the game that might be useful to recognize in the Divine Comedy. One is that if it's set in 1300, from the evening of Good Friday to the evening of Easter Thursday, the dead people that he meets have to be dead by this time. So that's part of the game he's playing. So he can't put Boniface the Eighth in hell at that time, but he can predict that Boniface the Eighth will be there. He needs, as Virgil needs to have a way to predict the future of Rome in Book 6 of the Aeneid. You've got some mechanism like that when Dante the Pilgrim in the poem meets his forebear Cacciaguida in heaven and gets some predictions too. So you've got to play this game where you're balancing the fact that the only people you can actually meet on the way are those who died by this time in 1300, and still that he wants to comment on things that are very contemporary to him. Another rule of the game is that there's contrapasso, that is, you've got a form of punishment or suffering that is fitting to the thing being punished. So the lovers in one of those upper stories of hell, Paolo and Francesca, they get blown around by winds that never cease, because that's what that kind of love is like. If you're just going to have erotic love bear everything else away, well, then you're just going to get blown around by it, and so on. You see this over and over again in Inferno. You see it in Purgatorio, which is also punishment, but it's a different. It's not a punishment without hope. It's a punishment that leads to heaven. And then even it can't be quite passo, which is from suffering, passion, in the Paradiso. But there's something fitting about where you see the souls of heaven appearing in the various spheres of the celestial world. So there are three canticles. We use that term to describe the big divisions. One is the Infernal of Hell, as it were, which really, Inferno just means that which is below, underneath. The Purgatorio, where every person that he meets, that Dante the Pilgrim meets in Purgatorio, will end up in the company of the blessed eventually, in paradise, Paradiso. But they have to undergo purgation. And he creates the most indelible image of purgatory you're going to find anywhere. And he, I think it's safe to say, advances even the dogma of purgatory in a way that only a person of his imagination could do. He puts at the top of purgatory the Garden of Eden, which is very interesting because it makes us think about that life of virtue, which is what purgative suffering leads to, is that if we live our lives in a way that is open to smoothing out our rough edges, is causing us to lose the things that hold us back from loving fully. Well, what that leads us to is a life that is like that before the fall. And there he meets his great beloved. So his guide through hell and through purgatory is the great poet Virgil, who is, for Dante, he's the poet, and sums up all the ancient wisdom. And so we see the pagan classical antiquity, Latin antiquity, being drawn up by Dante, but then he's being led to something higher, and that's the figure of Beatrice, who shows up in this most remarkable way. We'll see it when we read these selections. She's being led in a triumph at which Christ is a griffin who's pulling her chariot along. I mean, it's a remarkable moment, which tells us that Dante's sense of love is that God's care for each of us can be mediated by a person. That is, that eros and agape can truly be personalized in this profound way. And anyway, it's a stunning reformulation of romance. And then Beatrice is the guide through the spheres of heaven. But in the end, she gives way to, of all people, the last of the guides, Bernard of Clairvaux. He's the last of the guides, and he leads to the vision of the Trinity, which that's the ultimate vision. And inside that vision of the Trinity, which Dante the Pilgrim is trying to describe for us, kind of, there's the sacred humanity of Jesus. So this is it's as ambitious a piece of literature as has ever been written. It's in 100 cantos, 34 in the first, and the Inferno. There's kind of preparatory. It's really cantos 1 and 2 though that are preparatory. So it's not quite being too neat here. And then there's 33 in the Purgatorio and 33 in the Paradiso. And that's 33 is important because not only is it Trinity tripled, it's the accepted, well, it's the traditional aging of Christ when he goes through the mystery of the Triduum. So that's interesting because this is a poem for every man, every human. That is, it's inviting us in the middle of our life. We find ourselves lost. And if we've ever found ourselves, and it's a grace, right, to know that things that one necessarily just comes up taking for granted, to have a moment where we don't take it for granted anymore. We say, I've got to ask myself, what's the path I'm on? And maybe it isn't so bad to know that we're lost. Maybe that's a grace. And if the every man, the every human of Christ is the one in whom the way of being human is taken up and realized according to its great mission of wisdom and love, well, that's a process that's going to be painful. We're going to have to leave behind things that we thought were certainties that we have now come to see. Maybe they're not so certain anymore. What does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to have power in the world? What should we do with the power or talents we've been given? This Dante, when he was in exile, an exile that never ended for him, he had to come to the most existential despair. He had to face what it means to be alive. Why is it worth continuing? And that's what all of that drama, the very blood of the exile, of the dark night, that's what makes this poem, the Commedia, the Divine Comedy, so indispensable. And it really is a poem that I can say without reserve is something all of us can take up and say and experience and endure it in a way that lifts us up, that puts us into a context that we can say of our journey. This painful process of life is filled with light, that there's something that makes sense here. Getting at that's what the poet, Dante, does for us in the Commedia. And maybe we will find that in the tragedies which are never minimized, we find that this is a comedy. Things turn out well. All manner of things shall be well.